Hey everybody, welcome back to the Tonic Accord. This is Alex Kapitko, joined by my friend and colleague Drew Nepley. What's up, man?
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back, everybody.
So, Drew, today I want to talk about herd immunity, lockdowns, and how to properly balance harm in this age of the coronavirus. Especially in the United States, I think both sides are just being ingenuous about this. As we've seen, Trump clearly wants to reopen everything. And basically, he said, sorry, grandma may have to be lost along the way, but we need to get the economy going. And on the same note, it's clear that many on the left see this as a great opportunity to try and restructure American policies. And my problem with both of these is that when the ship is sinking on the Titanic, you shouldn't be debating how to fix the lifeboats for the next problem. And it's just kind of an unfortunate side effect of this corona problem. And I'm someone that's kind of in the middle of both of these, where I think we need to find a proper balance of harm between what could potentially happen in an economic meltdown and also how we can protect as many people as possible. And I think the problem is that the media has focused so much on the negative news and the negative side of this that a lot of people aren't really getting a great understanding of what's happening. We hear terms like herd immunity, but no one even wants to talk about it because it's not kind of in the it's a counter idea that could be dangerous. It could be good. So today I just kind of want to talk about everything in between. So what are your thoughts on kind of how maybe other countries have handled this? How the United States should be handling this? Just what are your general thoughts on where we're at right now?
Well, my initial thought is that it's going to be varied by country, right? Because it's not like countries have the same infrastructure, the same populations, the same population density, the same access to transportation. There's just a lot of different factors. So I think first off, we have to realize that what one country does that may seek success or failure does not automatically mean that should then be applied across the world, right? And that there's a lot of differences in the way countries are structured that can affect how the responses are then received. So before we even go into the specifics, that's what I just kind of want to get out there is like what may work somewhere may not work somewhere else, basically. So
Yeah.
I definitely see, I want to look at the early responders first. We look at South Korea is one of the early responders to this virus. They did pretty intensive preparations for testing. They did pretty intensive tracking of contact tracking. And in general, the South Korean people were very responsive to the recommendations that their government had set in place. So that's something that I noticed immediately. That's like, okay, like they had a really quick response. They didn't completely shut down everything in their country, right? But they had a very quick response that was listened to by the populace, and it seemed to be pretty effective. They were one of the first countries to actually bend and flatten their case curve. I don't think that other countries didn't have that similar response, right? Like Italy was like too late. And so I think that the response then has to change when you're kind of too late. If you already have a massive outbreak that's already spread, you can't really do the case tracking to try and locate the original source. The cat's already too out of the bag, and that's why countries like Italy and Spain had to do more widespread lockdowns, is because I think they were just kind of too late, and so then their response had to be different than South Korea's.
Amen. Yes, I completely agree with that. I think the discussion is wrong that we're having in a lot of countries. I think there's been a lot of criticism on countries like Sweden. And then there's comparisons with Sweden and the United Kingdom, and we can get into that later, but just kind of for this beginning part, I think the answer is less lockdowns or staying open, but it's more the timeliness of when you responded and how quickly you responded.
Right.
Because it's true that if you had the proper mechanisms in place early enough, then it probably would be easier to stay open. And that's the problem in places like the UK, because they have obviously seen, I believe now they have the highest death rates in Europe. And they were pushing for herd immunity, or Boris Johnson was pushing for this herd immunity idea back in March. And their problem is that basically Brexit had happened in December, and the Labour Party had completely collapsed, and there was no opposition to Boris Johnson, and there was the internal chaos of this Brexit vote. And so the whole country had their eyes fixated on Brexit,
Right.
and Boris Johnson was not listening to his experts. And that was the big problem that happened there. I think it was less the idea of herd immunity, which we can get into in a bit, but it was more the idea of no one was prepared and health experts were not being utilized. And as you mentioned, in places like Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, experts were prepared. And of course, that is because there was SARS, and there were many other bird flus that have come out of that region. So they obviously are much more prepared than other parts of the West. And I think it also does come down to the fact that in a lot of these Asian countries, people wear masks if they're sick already.
Right.
They're prepared for this. They've had the dress rehearsal, and now they were ready for the big game. And I think that's the big issue. And I think you said that very well. My big concern is that I think there's been some disingenuous conversations about flattening the curve in the West. Flattening the curve is meant to buy us time and meant to buy our hospitals time.
Uh-huh.
A lot of the images of flattening the curve that have been shown by public health officials do not show the end part where the numbers spike again. Because flattening the curve only works if people stay home until there's a vaccine. And I think that's one of the biggest issues is we were prepared for the beginning, and I would argue that we've reacted well at the beginning, or at least over the last few months, but there's really no end game.
I mean, that's an interesting point, right? There's a lot of talk about the second wave. What happens when we start to reopen again if everyone is still not like immunized or vaccinated? I would disagree with you in that claim that we acted well in the beginning. I don't think we did. I think we acted too late. I think the United States acted too late. I think a lot of countries acted too late. And I think it's obvious that the countries that acted earlier are in a better position. Taiwan, South Korea. These are countries that, like you said, had historically they were closer to the SARS virus, so maybe it's more fresh in their mind. They also, countries like South Korea and Taiwan, and Hong Kong, which is also doing better than European countries in the West. They all don't trust China, right? They don't trust China, and they didn't trust what was coming out of China. They did their own research. We talked about before how Taiwan was even trying to warn the WHO of human contact before anyone was talking about it. I would argue those countries did do it right in the beginning, and Europe and the West and the United States in particular did not. I don't think we handled it well in the beginning, and the experts have said that. I mean, even Fauci in the administration has said, had we acted earlier, we would have saved thousands of more lives. I mean, it's a fact.
Let me clarify what I mean when I said we acted well. We acted accordingly to the panic that then begun. We did what was necessary to lock down. That's more what I mean, is that we basically, once the panic began, we put the hammer down. And we put the hammer down and locked down, quite hard lockdowns in most of the West. And that's what I mean, is that we took the most extreme measures once we reacted. Right. And it's worked in bringing the numbers down over the last month. But so more my point is, though, we don't really have a next step. There's no sunset.
Sure.
Like, there's so much argument over what the next step is.
And that's definitely true. You're absolutely right there, that this next step is now tough, especially when we do have this looming threat of a failing economy, record unemployment numbers across the globe, in the United States as well. I mean, you're definitely right that this question, the next step, is really scary and is going to be tough to figure out. And so let's dive into what our next steps could be.
Yeah.
Sweden, right? We talked about Sweden. Sweden is now being looked at as, well, maybe this is an alternative way to go about this. Sweden had not done hard lockdowns. They just recommended social distancing, but bars and restaurants had remained open. They do recommend to wear masks and social distance. And so, again, when we do talk about how different countries and peoples within their countries respond differently, I do think that Sweden is particularly unique. I read an article from Business Insider. 7 people in Sweden told us why they think their government made the right call, having no coronavirus lockdown. and they were pretty clear that most people are happy with the country's strategy. It's definitely interesting to see. Only about 11% of people polled are not trusting the government's response.
Mm-hmm.
But Swedish people also said that they have widespread trust in authority and a community spirit, which means that
Mm-hmm.
Swedes socially distance without strict rules being needed to be applied, right? They heard the expert of their government say, hey, we need to socially distance as long as we continue to do this with masks. Hopefully we can avoid a full lockdown. And Swedes were willing to accept that and do that. I don't see that happening in the United States, where we don't have this community trust in our authority. Not at all. In fact, that's why we have people protesting with guns in front of Capitol Hills. There's an innate cultural aspect to Americans that have a distrust of authority and a general distaste towards government and control that I think that is completely different than Swedish culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what I do have to say, because I think in some aspects I agree with you that Sweden is probably more of an outlier than it is the case to be studied here. And actually, on that, Sweden I think is more like these Asian countries like Hong Kong, South Korea, where their trusted authority is high, and that is an important thing to keep in mind.
Right.
And also, they have one of the best healthcare systems in the world and good public aid programs, and they're quite affluent. So that is very clear, right?
Yes.
But I was really interested, though, to look at Statistica, which I usually trust most of their numbers. It's just a statistic website.
Sure.
And so Spain has an 11% death rate right now of the infected, with about 26,000 dead out of 221,000 affected, making that 11%. Italy has 13.8 death rate of the 216,000 infected, 30,000 have died. And now Sweden, there have been about 3,000 deaths out of 24,600 affected, and that's a 12% death rate. So we have 11% in Spain, 13.8 in Italy, and 12.3 in Sweden. And I guess I have an economic mind in a lot of these things. And I don't like the argument that's thrown around in the US is that if you care about the economy, you don't care about human lives, because I think it's a BS argument. And the point I'm trying to make is I think we need to find a way to balance the harm. And the thing is that you have Sweden, a country that didn't lock down, which has about the same death rate as Italy and Spain, which both had hard lockdowns. And clearly it's not the same thing. But the weird thing is that Spain and Italy are obviously Southern European countries that have a lower trust in government, and they lock down because, they both had dictatorships, fascist regimes that have led to, poor economies and a lack of trust and authority. And they've had to lock down, but still they don't have much different of a death rate. And Bloomberg says that what Sweden's done may actually save them the deep parts of this recession that's coming. Though it's still going to be bad, it could be better.
Okay.
And so my point is that Sweden could be better off from this, and they didn't have to close everything. And some of these countries that closed everything are still about the same with death percentages, but also their economies are paralyzed.
But you're okay. But I think you're looking at the wrong statistic. You're looking at the death rate of those already infected, right? I think that's pretty much going to be the same across the board. Maybe a little bit higher in a population that's older. But what we should look at is, let's look at Sweden compared to its neighbors as far as the number of infected. Sweden's death toll over 2,900 is far higher than countries next to it, like Norway and Denmark. There's a stark difference. Per capita, Sweden has a 6 times higher rate of infected than Norway and a 3 times higher rate of infected than Denmark. So yes, so that's why there is concern that we don't fully know the extent of this response, of Sweden's response. It could be work and it could have the economic benefits, but where we stand right now is it is leading to more people getting infected than its neighbors. Now, again, back to that balance of harm, I do understand your argument, though, that we do have to consider the economy. And you're absolutely right that the argument that if you're talking about the economy, you must not care about those who die. Yeah, and that's that Facebook argument style where it's just me versus you, and if you don't with me, then you're against me. I agree with you that that's not productive, and people that are saying that we do need to have a discussion about our economy. Of course we do. I agree with you. And certainly we have to consider all the people that are being affected, that all the unemployed because of lockdowns. We have to make sure that they get assistance, or there's at least a pathway to back to employment or stability. I 100% agree with you that we have to have that conversation. But I do think that with Sweden, as far as death rate is not the statistic we need to be looking at, because that's going to be around the same because of just the nature of the virus. We have to be looking at how many people are getting infected before the death rate kicks in.
Now, the one thing I will say to that, though, is that I think it's inevitable that Sweden's going to have higher infection rates at the beginning because they haven't had a lockdown. They haven't had a strict lockdown.
Right.
So
okay.
inevitably, and now I only think we'll be able to actually have a debate like what the outcome of this is in about a year or two, right?
Yeah.
Because right now there's just not enough information out there.
Right.
But I think it's going to be obvious that Sweden's going to have more infections just because of the scenario of it.
It's that curve. It's the spike of the curve. Yeah.
Exactly. But like, I guess the point of this is that if a total lockdown, obviously, yeah, you're right, the death rates are going to be the same right now. But I'm talking about the long term, because right now, The Economist, now this is a week old, but The Economist reported that for every one death, 500 people lost their jobs. That's in the United States. And so my point is that the death rates are the same now, but Sweden might be able to recover better after this starts to slow down than countries that are completely locked down. So we could see a whole other type of death rates come out of some of these other countries when the governments can't get everyone enough money, or food shortages start occurring, like we're slowly seeing in places even in the United States. So I think that's the problem. Is it a short-term infection spike that could actually in the end lead to less deaths? We don't know, but I think it's worthy of a conversation.
It's absolutely is, and that is a good point, right? That I think you were definitely right to remind me that just by default, by the way that they are handling the coronavirus, by default of its scheme, then it will have a higher amount of infected at first, but it's that over long term, perhaps it's less deadly. That is a good point. And again, I think you're absolutely right that we'll probably have to revisit. I mean, again, the old phrase, hindsight is 2020. We'll have a lot better understanding of the correct response in a year or 2 or 3 down the line. And certainly this herd immunity is worth looking into. I also just fear that it's being co-opted by people that are protesting in the United States, that it's being co-opted for the wrong reasons, right? Like, people are looking at Sweden and being like, see, you don't have to have a lockdown. So then that means that I don't have to wear a mask at all. And then I can do whatever, because, okay, just to give you an example. Now, I do think it's a minority, but there are people in the United States that are pretty much think this is a hoax. There are signs near my hometown of Simi Valley in Southern California. There were signs that, I have the photo. There were signs that said, we're open to the truth. No masks allowed. Handshakes okay. Hugs very okay. That was in Simi Valley at a carpeting store. They said no masks allowed. Handshakes okay. Like, that's going against, like, I fear that people in the United States, at least, are going to be, are going to be doing stupid things like not socially distancing at all because of this politicization. And then they'll be saying things like, look at Sweden, disingenuously, when Swedes themselves are saying, no, we trust our government and we're enforcing social distancing. We're just not doing a full lockdown.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because like you touched on earlier, the Swedish people, I mean, I think naturally there's somewhat of social distancing inside of Sweden.
True.
And theirs is less of a rebellious. I think that's the problem which we have now in the United States, is that people are fed up and there's this rebellious nature now to it because like you said, Americans are so questioning of authority that it's become that. And that's the problem of this, is because unfortunately people like Trump have kind of clung on to the Swedish model without actually understanding it. Mm-hmm. And herd immunity, I mean, just so I think I should just say the definition of herd immunity, just so people really know what it is, because I've heard it thrown around on Facebook in conservative circles, and I've seen CNN disingenuously discredit it. And herd immunity is just a form of indirect protection from infectious diseases that occurs when a large percentage of the population become immune to it, right? Like, it makes sense.
You develop
go out in public.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that is one thing. But being careless is another thing. And that's the problem where we're at in the United States. And that kind of goes back to, what I said at the intro, is that it's become a disingenuous argument in the United States between both sides.
Right.
It really has, and I just don't know where we go from here. But I've heard some experts like Dr. David Katz, who I think he's a public health expert from Yale, and he was actually working in hospitals in New York City for a while, and he had basically said that almost not having immunity could make the second wave worse.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's an interesting point, is because if we're all hiding in home and then we start opening up and go back outside and there's no immunity, it's probably just going to be Groundhog Day, but maybe worse.
Right. It also makes me wonder again about like the population density and where it is in the United States. Like, for example, like first of all, over half the coronavirus cases in the United States are in New York. Right.
Right.
So, you probably have large swaths of land in the Midwest that have a case or two here and there, maybe, but it's not like this, it's not like an outbreak like you have in New York. So perhaps you do have a different response in a different part of the state. Still legitimately expert, an expert opinion understood response, right? Not just like some politician to go on a whim. But like if you do have experts, they're like, yeah, maybe you can get away with herd immunity in more rural areas where there's less population density. We can, and we don't have a huge influx of people taking up beds. We have the infrastructure to take on stuff. I can see that, and I'm willing to have that conversation. You're definitely right that there's, on both sides of the political spectrum, there's this inability to have any sort of nuance. It's either complete lockdown, or else you don't care about human lives, or it's, this tyrannical government won't let me live. It's like, oh my gosh, guys, like, where's the nuance? And I do think that's part of the nuance is the location of what we're talking about. Again, Sweden is not nearly as dense of a population than New York City is. Sweden is also very affluent and has a good healthcare system. Countries that are more impoverished or developing are going to have a different type of response. And it's this nuance that we definitely need to maintain in our, and I do think it's the trust of experts, right? So if there are experts that are telling me that, hey, maybe in more rural areas we can do more of a herd immunity or less intense lockdown, I am absolutely willing to hear that out, 100%.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a very good point, is we can't have the so like one size fits all policy for the
Yes.
United States. It's just too big of a country, And I think that, because I actually slowly have become someone who supports a moderate opening up of the country and the economy, just because someone, I forget who it was, compared this to Vietnam, where we burned down the village to save the people.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and I sort of get it, because yes, I think New York should still be on some extreme lockdowns, because it's true, they have extremely high rates, and they just did not have the resources in elderly homes. The hospitals were overloaded, and flattening the worked there, and it still needs to be controlled. But I mean, in California and Texas and some of these bigger states, the cases are just not there. And the problem is, I think we're starting to forget that people die from other things.
Uh-huh.
And these hospitals, there's reports that some hospitals in California and Texas are at 30% capacity, but they're not seeing patients for other ailments and other surgeries.
Yeah.
And that worries me, because what if you're in your 80s or your 90s, and you're kind of at the twilight of your life? And yeah, you're safe from coronavirus, but maybe you have other ailments, other problems, or you maybe just want to risk it and see your grandkids before you can't, I think we're missing some of the social cost of it. And it's, to me, it's just a little bit alarming, because this is an interesting example. So I'm curious how you're going to like this, but so we've been talking about other countries, right? But there was another flu, the Hong Kong flu, in 1968 and 69. And it killed an estimated 1 million people around the world, 100,000 in the United States. And I want to make it clear, I'm not comparing these two, as the same thing, but I think it's an interesting example, is that nothing was locked down, and Woodstock still happened. And there were like 30,000 people in Woodstock while this was going around the globe, killing
There's like 300,000 people in Woodstock, actually.
Oh yeah, excuse me. Yeah, 300,000.
Yeah.
And that'd be like if Coachella was put on steroids and happening right now during this pandemic. And so I just have a problem with, I mean, you and I talked about this weeks ago about, it's hard to get rid of some of these government control programs once they're in place. And
Sure.
I think there is a valid discussion to be had about how much authority do we want posed on this. And it's just, I think we almost, I'm not saying the cure is worse than the disease, but it kind of could be. Like, fear is a powerful tool.
Yes, well, and there is, like you mentioned, there's other factors, right? Like, if you really do have another great recession or something, that is going to lead to other deaths from other things, right? We talk, starvation, suicides, right? It's hard to get an exact number. Like, of course, we can't predict the future of what else will happen, but there's obviously side effects to shutting down an economy, and that's actually one of the reasons Sweden did do a different thing. They said that there are other concerns than just there's other concerns for the Swedish populace than just getting infected. So I get that. I get it. I do get it. And it's hard to know what to do. It is hard to know what to do. I do think, though, that the lesson that we need to learn from Sweden is that this is a country that has a respect and understanding for the experts in their country, right? So, I think that is we need to get back. And I think Fauci is doing a pretty good job of trying to cross the bridges between politics and trying to bring people together under some expert knowledge. But I just see such a cultural difference and definitely this disingenuous and lack of nuance on all sides of this conversation that we have to get rid of. We have to listen to experts. We have to let experts also disagree, right? There can be two experts that come to different conclusions, and they need to have these nuanced debates and arguments instead of, Facebook debates where it's, this tyrannical government's taking away all my rights, or you're just a billionaire shill that doesn't care about my grandmom. Like, it's just that kind of stuff is certainly not productive.
No, it's not. And I think that's a really good point, is that we need to let experts talk. We need to listen to experts, but we also need to let experts disagree.
Yes.
And it's true. This David Katz, this doctor from Yale, who I pretty much agree with his take on this whole crisis. It's kind of a middle, which I guess is kind of a lot of my views, but he was completely chastised by New York Times readers because he put out an op-ed that disingenuously they called "Is the Cure Worse Than the Disease?" He has said the article was not actually called that, but they changed the title.
Interesting. Wow.
And it was him just saying that maybe there is a bit of an overreaction.
Yeah.
And maybe we do need to realize that two things can be true at the same time. And he got destroyed by the left.
Yeah.
And of course loved by Trump. And he was like, no, I don't want Trump to retweet my article, and I don't want the left to condemn me. He's like, Two things can be true at once here. And it pisses me off just because it's just so disingenuous. And I mean, as we know, the news media knows that negative news gets clicks,
yes.
And we keep hearing stories about the healthy 30-year-old who died of the virus but there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be cases, but this virus is predominantly killing older people or unhealthy people. And unfortunately, the U.S. has both of those quite highly. And that's why at the end of the day, it is a serious disease, but I don't think we're tackling it correctly. And it's a big failure as a nation.
Well, we're certainly like, I think we also hit on this earlier, right? That like we could have had a very different response had we understood and been appropriately informed earlier. But alas, that didn't happen. Okay, so now we're in the situation where a kind of a panic happened and people shut down. I do think that there is some good appropriate responses. I mean, here in Southern California, we were actually one of the first to have a case. One of the first cases in the United States was in Orange County, just south of Los Angeles. This was right around the Super Bowl, right around in February. There's reports of cases in Orange County. A month later, in March 17th, California had to stay at home. LA completely shut down. And now, LA is doing pretty good on cases. Absolutely. Right. So there's definitely is merit to the idea of maybe we should have gotten on earlier. It's too late now. We have to do a main shutdown because we don't want a shock to our healthcare system. Now that you're right that now we're kind of in the middle game, it's kind of halftime. And maybe I can concede that, okay, now we're at halftime. Maybe we start to look at what do we do? How do we change our defensive strategy for the second half? That's a good point. But I do think that like a lot of states had to make their own calls because of the lack of leadership from the president. We didn't have a national response, and I don't think a lot of people understood which experts to trust because, Trump was at rallies saying it was a Democratic hoax in mid-February. So we did have the result was states had to kind of do their own thing, and maybe some states went too far, but maybe some states didn't go far enough. I don't know. Again, a lot of this is going to be hindsight, but I also think that personally, whether you agree with what your state is doing or not, it is still important to obey the laws. And if you want to protest, I understand that right. I do understand that right, but there are ways to do it that's still socially distancing and still adhering to guidelines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean it's true that unfortunately too the narrative, and I mean not just even the narrative, just what's happening on the ground is that some of these more conservative states are opening up way too quickly, and I would argue that states like Michigan and California maybe aren't allowing enough discussion about opening up. And it kind of stems from where we're at right now because states pretty much had to be their own testing grounds.
Yeah.
But I do think in some ways there's a weird positive to that, is that because we're such a big nation and because we have such different populations and different ideas, we're allowed to test this. And obviously a pandemic is not the time to be testing this, but I do think the solution will come out of one of these states, obviously in some time. And just hopefully it's good. I just think if this second wave comes, I don't know how prepared we're going to be for it, and that does scare me, and especially if people are not doing well financially and they're scared and angry. I think there's just a lot of factors to this that aren't discussed, and I mean, this sounds cold, so I'm going to try to say it the best way I can, but this is also a problematic crisis because the people that are going to mainly get hurt by this are the younger generations. Yeah. Like the people who are needing to get out and start something in the workforce in their lives. Older people who are the most risk can most likely most of the time stay at home because a lot of them have more money and experience and are okay staying home, And so we're protecting them, but we might be looking at a lost decade, a lost generation, a lost workforce for a while, I mean, The Economist talks about how in Southern Europe, like Spain and Italy, middle-aged millennials have seen 2 economic crises in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And that takes a giant toll on a population and just the zeitgeist. And
absolutely.
It's worrying to me a little bit that I don't know. And I do think we need to start talking about what's next. But you're right, is that the leadership from the top hasn't been good. And I mean, I guess I laughed when I saw it because it was on one of the late night shows. But when I thought about it more, it was bad. But, Trump's in that mask factory, no mask, telling the press he was wearing a mask. He's like, oh, yeah, you just didn't see it. It's like, well, you weren't wearing it on people.
I know. I mean,
it's disgusting.
Yeah. I mean, look, that again, like, I don't even know what Trump's doing anymore. I mean, he's not like apparently people in the White House have been tested positive for coronavirus. Trump hasn't been wearing a mask at all in any of his outings. It's like, okay, man, like whatever. I don't even know what he's doing, but yeah, I mean, we definitely, I think the main takeaway I get from this conversation we just had is that we definitely do need to kind of maybe, have a more nuanced conversation about the next step. I absolutely agree with that. I just don't see either side having a nuanced conversation. I see. No. Perhaps the experts are right, but I see the general populace now. It's getting more and more politicized. I mean, again, this is anecdotal, but someone I knew from Simi Valley, they'll remain nameless, but they were posting all over Facebook that like, if you're not out there, if you're going against my protesting, you're going against the Constitution and my rights. And it's like, dude, it's like, no one's going against your First Amendment rights. They're going against your ability to get their grandmom sick because you're putting your hands all over the crosswalk. Like, there's so much now tribalism getting involved in this that it's really worrying. I mean, again, we've already talked about this. It's already been here, but it's like it's getting more and more attached to tribalism and politics when it should be just experts trying to figure out the best solution. And so I think you and I are both on the same page where we just need to have a more nuanced conversation about our next step.
Yeah. I mean, I would rather argue with anyone any day if it's about solutions.
Yes.
It's not about, it's a leftist conspiracy or blah, 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 And I mean, I think the diamond in the rough, this is what Elon Musk said, was that this might be a good test for what's next. This might be the like some the practice round, the dress rehearsal of the next pandemic, because it's looking like this one might not be as serious as we first thought, at least in the short term. But there's going to be another one, and maybe, just maybe, we'll learn some things from this.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about Osterholm, right? The guy that was on Joe Rogan, who also said that this will probably affect 70% of America by the end. He's the Minnesota Center of Disease Control guy. He worked for five presidents. Well, I decided to start reading his book, Deadliest Enemy: Our War Against Killer Germs, because I don't know, I'm kind of fascinated in pandemics, and he basically makes the point that like the difference between a pandemic and an endemic and an epidemic is that more people die in Africa from AIDS and malaria every year, but it's something that's just already enrooted in there, and we don't think twice about it. So there's really no fear in the first world. But something like this, that, I mean, even something like anthrax, it's really hard to spread and kill people because it's new. It creates a fear. And sometimes we have to be careful to react to the fear itself.
That's definitely true. That's a really good point. And I think that applies to even more than just pandemics, right? Of course, you always have to make sure you're not overreacting based off of fear.
Yeah.
And I can see how a lot of people might think that about lockdowns is an overreaction based off of fear. And perhaps maybe hindsight shows it will be, but I don't know. Who knows, man? It is certainly it's certainly tough. I think you had to make. I think to kind of button up this conversation. I think you have a really good point that hopefully we will use this pandemic as an opportunity to learn, right? Learn as much as possible about how to handle a pandemic in a globalized world. And how to appropriately, give accurate information and make sure that we have people on the same page. Hopefully, we can learn from this, and and so that if we have something even more deadly or more serious, we're better equipped. It's a common theme throughout history in general, right? Is you have to learn from your mistakes or learn from the mistakes of the past generations. And then again, also we also know that great victories only come out of times of great tragedy. So maybe the silver lining will be some revolutionary new way to stop this, or a vaccine generated that can, maybe there'll be a great victory at the end. Hopefully we can remain some kind of positive. I hope everyone out there listening is absolutely staying safe. However you feel is best, and whatever your recommendations are where you live. Wash those hands, socially distance, and hopefully we can all make it out of this smarter and healthier.
Thanks, guys. And yeah, as usual, you can find us on the plethora of podcast sites, Podbean, iTunes, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and all those other ones that some of them I don't even remember the names, but we'll be back later this week with catching up. And yeah, have a great week, and thanks for listening.
And let us know if you have any topics you want us to cover, or any cool stories you find interesting. We're absolutely all ears to hear what you guys think. Thanks again.